people, it is my honour and privilege to welcome you to the 150th annual R-Rocks Atheists video. This year brought to you by Bionicdance and Gary Edwards. At least that's kind of how it feels. It seems like we're round here once again. What I want to do in this year's presentation, unlike last year's video, R-Rocks Atheists, or rather Why Aren't Rocks Atheists, I think is what I called it. I don't want to just go through the same ground. Again, I want to do things a little bit differently this time so that because I can hear the sighs already, mostly because the sighs are coming from myself, I think, right, that we're back here again. So I want to just touch on a different aspect on it, just to keep things a little bit fresh. What has prompted this? Gary Edwards had made a video talking about defining atheism, and Bionicdance had made a response video, not her first, defining atheism, and they have both taken, you could say, a logical approach. Gary Edwards very much a formal logical approach, as his wont, and Bionicdance a kind of what I would call a kind of semantic pedantry, but nevertheless they are both logical approaches to defining the word. I don't want to suggest that what I'm going to do in this video is illogical, but there's going to be nothing formal in terms of the logic that is within this video. It's going to be a lot more practical in how it is looking at defining the word. What I will say is that Gary Edwards has cleared up his video. It sounded when I listened to his video as if he was being very descriptive in terms of defining the word atheist and saying this is what the word atheist means, whereas he's cleared it up. What he's actually doing is saying, no, I think this would be a better way of defining the word atheism. So I'm going to take Gary's lead and I'm going to come up with what I think would be a better way of defining the word atheist, and I'm going to do it looking at the three things that he looked at, which was rocks, babies and uncontacted tribes persons. So what I'm going to assume is that the rest of the world has finally come to its senses and decided that the definitions that we have for words aren't always as good as they could be, and that by far the best thing to do is to allow me to redefine all the words in the dictionary on your behalf. I've already made a start on it. I've already redefined handsome to mean having a large forehead. Now I'm going to move on to the word atheist. Before I go on to these three categories that I want to consider and maybe have a little bit of fun with, of rocks, babies and tribes people, what I want to do before that is just to briefly outline what my definition would be before applying it to these different things. And it would go something along these lines. Rather than just simply describing an atheist as a person who has the lack of a belief in God, I think it ought to be an important criteria to specify the cognitive faculties such that one has the potential both to understand the proposition God exists and the specific conceptualization of God that we are talking about. Where I disagree with Gary Edwards is that one needs to be aware of that specific proposition, or to have expressed a propositional attitude, not least a doxastic attitude to that proposition. That's the difference that I have with Gary Edwards' position. I think we have to have those cognitive faculties, but I don't think we have to have been exposed to the proposition in question. When I give you the three examples of rocks, babies and tribespeople, it will probably become clear why I make that differentiation. So what I want to do now then is outline those three things and show you where, if I had the ability to redefine the word, I would redefine the word. Just a word of caution on redefining words. You can do a lot of damage redefining words when you redefine a word and everybody else hasn't. As I discussed on my blog last year with regard to the redefining of the word misogyny to mean things that are substantially less than the hatred of women, you can end up getting involved in a process that I called smearing by equivocation by proxy. In other words, you use a word to mean one thing and you can insist that that was all that you meant, but you know full well that other people will interpret that word in a different way and think badly of people in a way that is unfair and inappropriate. I don't think that is the case with the word atheist in terms of the differences that I would make and that I outline in this video. Okay, enough of the bullshit talk. Let's get on with the first thing to consider. The first thing to consider is rocks. Rocks. So here's our old friend the Rock. And is our old friend the Rock an atheist? Do I want our old friend the Rock to be classed as an atheist? No. No, I don't want our old friend the Rock to be classed as an atheist. And let me try and explain why. For a start, I discussed in the last video on this usage and the fact that in terms of the dictionary definition, the rocks are not classed as atheists. It specifically says in the dictionary it is a person who, an atheist is a person who, atheism. Right? And in terms of usage, I've never known anybody out there talk about rocks as atheists, even Bionicdance herself. If you watch a Bionicdance video other than those, and she is the ultimate champion for rocks as atheists, but other than the videos where she's talking about that, she talks about atheists all the time. And the assumption always is that we understand that she is talking about human beings. She never feels the need at the beginning of the video to say, by the way, when I'm talking about atheists in this video, I'm purely talking about human atheists. I'm not talking about the rocks. And so when she says to us about this preacher is giving atheists a hard time, you think of the mental image you've already got before I've said anything. You're picturing a preacher, unless there's a sense of devilment within you and a little bit of a wry smile on your face, you're picturing a preacher talking to another human being. You're not picturing a preacher giving the fire and brimstone treatment to a fucking rock. Nobody talks about rocks as atheists in everyday life because that's not part of the everyday definition, which is how words are defined. But the question is, would we be better off defining rocks as atheists? I don't see why we would. Say we want to talk about the number of atheists in the UK. As we would do right now, we would survey 10,000 people, and as a result of that get a cross-section of people, and as a result of that we would be able to say, right, about 50% of the population are atheists, or 40% of the population are atheists, just by asking the appropriate questions. It's that simple. But if we incorporate atheists, rocks into that data becomes somewhat more difficult, because what do we do then? How do we? Well, presumably we don't have to count all the rocks in the United Kingdom before the Bionicdance fans come and point that out. No, we could do with the same thing as we do with a survey. We could just take some representative regions, count the number of rocks, and then extrapolate from there. But it's still not obvious to me what classes as a rock. Is each individual piece of gravel a rock? What about a grain of sand? It doesn't look like a rock, but isn't it just a little mini weeny grain of rock? And what about the bedrock that underpins the whole United Kingdom? What about the granite under Edinburgh? It's like one kind of continuum. Is that even a thing? Or is that just a bit of a... And I'm not suggesting this isn't some sort of mereological nihilistic claim here. I'm not suggesting that only the simplest component parts of things. I'm saying that it doesn't seem to be a discrete thing. It's just a continuum of rocks. So is that an atheist, or is it part of a larger atheist that is the whole planet? It's very difficult to get that there. And then, even if it is, to say that, well, there's a planet-sized atheist and that counts as one in our survey, and a grain of sand counts as one in our survey, and then we get our survey results, and rather than it being 40% atheist, 60% theist for the United Kingdom, we find out that the United Kingdom is 99.9999999% atheists. And I may be slightly out in that. I will hold my hand up now and say that I haven't done all the research I should have done for this video and counted the number of rocks in the United Kingdom. But lost in the data there is the bit that we really wanted to know, which is what percentage of people are atheists, because that is what we mean when we talk about atheists. the words that we use, this is the key point, the words that we use, we want them to work for us. We want them to serve a purpose. And if a word isn't fit for purpose, we either throw it away and get another word, or we change the definition of the word to allow the word to do the work that we want it to do. If we're including rocks in the definition of atheists, then the word atheist isn't doing the work we want the word to do. And that is why at the moment rocks are not classed as atheists, and I would not wish to see rocks classed as atheists. Let's leave the rocks behind now for another year. Until this time next year, let's move on to babies. Ooh, baby. Okay, so babies, a baby's atheist. Babies just like this one. I'll show you a baby just in case you've never happened to seen one before. Look at its little cheeks. Doesn't it probably look just like its dad, etc, etc, etc. So are babies like this one atheists? Well, the answer is yes, no, and no in that order. This is perhaps the most complicated of the three categories here, so let me try and explain, work through this one and try and bear with me. I'm not saying there literally is a bear with me. A large sign roaming around this room would make recording somewhat difficult. Now I want you to just bear with me while I try and go through this one. So the yes part of it, in terms of the definition that dictionaries generally give, which is a person who lacks a belief in God. Well, a baby lacks a belief in God, and we usually ascribe personhood to a baby. So under that definition, you can't get away from it. A baby is an atheist. However, for all the criticisms or just totally ignoring dictionary definitions that I've criticised some people, especially Bionicdance, for in this, there are legitimate criticisms that you can make of a dictionary definition, and one of them is that a dictionary definition is supposed to reflect usage. So if you don't feel that it is reflecting usage, that is an entirely legitimate criticism that you can make. And in terms of babies being atheists, I'm not so sure that the dictionary definition of a person who lacks a belief in God, it necessarily works for babies. Think about it this way. When we generally talk about people being atheists, we don't usually refer to babies. We would find it quite odd to start talking about babies in that sense. And certainly people there are some countries around the world, if they found out that you're an atheist, they'd probably try and chop your fucking head off, right? You're the lowest of the low. You're the absolute scum. If you're another person of the book, all they'll do is tax you for being so. If you have another religion that is not Abrahamic, they can just about tolerate you as long as you just fuck off straight away. But if they find out you're an atheist, that is the absolute scum of the earth. And yet they have babies, and they do not treat their babies as if their babies are atheists. So these people don't regard babies as atheists. Most people who are very religious in the United States do not regard their babies as atheists. And I don't think most atheists really regard their babies as atheists when they talk about people they know are atheists. Or when they talk about the fact that there aren't many, that everybody in Salt Lake City pretty much is a Mormon, they never say, well, actually that's not true because there's a lot of babies in Salt Lake City. It's just not something that we do, right? So I'm not exactly sure that dictionary definition is accurately reflecting the usage, which is what it's supposed to do. So that's the yes and the first no cleared up. But remember, it was a yes, no, and a no. And that yes and no deals with the situation as is with regard to dictionaries. But recall, what I'm doing in this video is giving you, in a moment of absolute sanity and clarity, you've all decided, the peoples of the world, to allow me to define all these words for you. So where do I stand? Well, where I stand is yet another Now, recall the definition that I gave that I would like to work towards if it was up to me, which is that you have to have the cognitive faculties, but you don't necessarily have to have been exposed to the concept or to the proposition. Babies, I do not believe, have the cognitive faculties. I do not believe that babies are innately theistic, and I would still argue with anybody that said that. I do believe, and this is a bone of contention that people might want to comment or respond to, that babies innately have a sense of the supernatural. Or at least if they don't at birth, as soon as they have the cognitive faculties to suspect supernatural agency, that they suspect supernatural agency. My pet cat, thick as shit as it is, has the cognitive faculties to suspect supernatural agency, and she suspects supernatural agency. When the wind blows the door shut, she shits herself and looks around thinking, who shut that door? It can't just have shut on its own. There must be some active agent there, some sentient agent that shut that door. I think human beings are the same. When we see inanimate processes cause things to happen, we have an expectation of agency, and of course that would have to be supernatural agency, since there is no natural agency to explain it. I think babies, or at least babies as they advance, have that innate sense, but I don't think they have an innate sense of God. In terms of then talking about them as atheists, because that is what some people will say, if they're not theists, they have to be atheists. They have to be, there's no way around it. In terms of the definition that I've given you, they don't have to be. And the reason that I like the way it fits in with babies is because labelling babies as atheists doesn't perform any work. When we get on to talk about tribes people, I'll contrast that for you and you'll see how it impacts differently there. But because all babies would class as atheists, it just becomes a meaningless distraction. It isn't something we'd want to include in any kind of statistics or in any kind of discussion about how many atheists there are, or where that atheism is leading. So I don't think it is very helpful. I don't think that classing babies as atheists performs the job that we want the word atheism to do. So let's move on to tribes people. Don't throw Britney Spears at me. No, that's not right. My good friend Michael Caine there, thank you for that, Mike. Really appreciated you recording that. So I want to talk now about tribes people, and I do mean tribes people rather than tribesmen. It is very important nowadays. It is the done thing that when we are talking about things which are gender neutral, that are inclusive of all sexes, of all genders, that we use a gender neutral term always and every time. Unless we're talking about the very concept of gender neutrality itself, in which case the word feminism will do for traditional reasons, because obviously tradition is very important in these things. So what about these tribes people? What about these uncontacted tribes? And let's, for the sake of simplicity, assume that everybody within the tribe, it's only a small group, let's assume they all believe the same thing. What about these uncontacted tribes that not only don't believe in God, but perhaps haven't even considered the concept of God in the first place? So what about these tribes? I'll show you one of these tribes here, just in case, again, you've never seen what a tribe looks like. Perhaps, I don't know, when you was young, you never bothered looking through a copy of National Geographic just in the hope of catching a bit of tribal tit somewhere through the pages. Not that I ever did anything like that. Do I think that these tribes people, I've put them away again, do I think that these tribes people should class as atheists? Yes, I do. Whether or not they have been exposed to the concept of a deity, and whether or not they've considered the proposition that that deity exists or not, or expressed a doxastic attitude in terms of that proposition. So, why is that then? This is where that I'm at odds with Gary Edwards. So let me try and explain to everybody, including Gary Edwards, what my position is here. Again, when we use a word, we want that word to perform work for us, to inform us, to be useful in the conversations in which we're liable to use that word. When we look at these tribes, we are interested in the politics of the tribe and the culture of the tribe and the morality of the tribe. And religion and belief in a God often has a very large part, a large say in these different aspects of any society, especially in societies like this where you might be making sacrifices to a God, where you may expect physical, very real, tangible divine retribution if you don't do what that God says. So really we want to set apart, if we find an uncontacted tribe, if we were to find an uncontacted tribe that lacked a belief in God, whether or not it had considered the God proposition or not, we would expect that to have some kind of bearing, perhaps on its moral outcomes, certainly in terms of the meta-ethical theory that underpins the moral outcomes that it makes, certainly in terms of its politics perhaps, or its culture, we would expect that to have some bearing. And I think that's where the delineator is. That would be where the interesting delineator would be, whether they lacked a belief or not whether they had considered the proposition or not. I don't think that's a very interesting place to draw the differentiator. Here are all the tribes that have considered whether God exists or not. Doesn't matter whether they believe or not, and this is their morality. These are the tribes that have never even considered it. I don't think that's a very interesting point to draw the line. I think the ones that we would want to clump together are all the ones that don't believe in a God, that haven't based their morality, or don't believe that they have based their morality around a God concept, right? That is the important thing. Whether or not that they've considered that God's concept or not, I don't think is very relevant to the kinds of things that we want to be informed about, the discussions we want to have with regard to these tribes. So that is why I propose the definition that I'm talking about here, because it excludes rocks and babies, because they don't have the cognitive faculties to consider a God concept or to express a doxastic attitude in the proposition God exists, but it does allow for such tribes people, regardless of whether or not they've actually explored a God concept, because that isn't a requirement. The requirement is simply to have the cognitive faculties sufficient to be able to consider such a concept, not to have actually considered such a concept. Lastly on this then, because this particular outcome of mine is in opposition to the outcome that Gary Edwards made. In his video, in Gary's video, he was very mocking. In fact, he used a shrill, mocking voice to outline the position of those of us who advocate regarding such tribes people as atheists. What I would say to Gary, I have no expectation whatsoever that I've said anything in this video that will have made you change your mind. What I do hope is that you will admit, albeit perhaps grudgingly, that there is a case to be made, that there is some potential benefit in grouping both these groups, those that have considered the concept in such tribes and those that have never considered the concept in such tribes, together under the same umbrella term atheist, that it's not as ridiculous or worthy of scorn as you make it out to be, and that it is something sensible and worthy of consideration. That's all I want to say. I want to leave it there. This has been a long video. I would very much like to thank those that have watched it all the way to the end. I'd also like to thank those people recently. I've had a welter of comments on the videos that I've made, and I really thank people for their input on there. I'd also like to thank those people that have supported the work that I'm doing on this channel via Patreon. That very helpful in terms of the time that I spend on here and justifying it that little bit. Thanks to everybody for watching. Bye for now.